Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to this TDL webinar on the subject of hardware security. Thank you very much for joining. We've got a great panel lined up to talk about the subject, and I'm going to hand over to Claire, who will moderate the session. I'd like to point out that the session will be recorded, made available on the TDL YouTube channel, and a short summary report will be available on our Substack account. So with that, Claire, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to TDL for hosting this series. Today, we have a really large topic, hardware security, its challenges, its past, its present, and its potential future. We could have spent days and maybe years discussing this topic, but today, we are going to try to paint the big picture of the field, its challenges, and its prospects. About 11 years ago, I was involved in a government initiative. One of the topics there was hardware security, and the participants were academics and industry researchers. The hardware security report was composed by the experts, but there was a writer allocated to brush up the text. The first sentence he selected for the report, based on what we said, was hardware could be the final century. This sentence was rejected. It was too dramatic for a technical report, but it's not entirely untrue. Hardware could be a final century, yet there are so many issues as well as so many positive developments in this area. And that's what we are going to discuss. We are fortunate to have a very distinguished panel with different areas of expertise today. We have Helena Hanshu. She is, among many other things, a technical board advisor for Q-Secure and SCI Semiconductors. We have Daniel Nemerov, who is a cybersecurity consultant and expert witness, and who spent decades on hardware security at Intel. We have Patrick Chaumont, professor and Joseph Samuel Satan Distinguished Fellow in Electrical and Computer Engineering at WPI. And finally, we have Radu Sayan, who is CEO of Private Machines, Inc., and computer science professor at Stony Brook. With that, I would like to thank our distinguished panelists for their participation and ask the first question. What are your overall views of hardware security and its state of the art, and to some extent its future? What do you think are the most important topics, the main challenges, and the most important innovation trends in hardware security today? Let's start with Helena. What do you think?
All right. Thank you very much, Claire and David, for the invitation to participate here. So, for me, hardware security has been around for a long time. In my personal life, it started with side channel attacks in 96, 97, 98. So it's been a while. And I think this topic is really still there because there's progress being made every day. New attacks and new protections are required. So that's definitely a big topic. But the newer ones, the microarchitectural side channels since 2018-ish, are important as well. So I'm sure we're going to talk more about that one at some point during this webinar. Other more deeper things in the hardware. Trojans, are they an issue or not? You know, puffs, do they secure anything or not? Can they help anti-counterfeiting? These kinds of things. Good topic, and still a lot of work to do. Maybe not that much progress in the area, but definitely looking forward, I think the actual revolution here is AI for us, right? For all of us. And because hardware is also there to support what the software industry wants to do, AI is going to be a big topic here because it helps side channels, it helps attack, but it helps protect. We have to protect the workloads themselves. So lots of things to be dealt with. A lot of good work still going to happen in the future.
Thank you, Helena. It's interesting that you think there wasn't too much progress. I heard that before, and to some extent it's discouraging, but certainly some progress was made. One question about the use of AI. You mentioned several areas where obviously it is useful, improving attacks and to some extent improving defenses and threat analysis. What about design? Does AI have potential, as Lisa Su said, in improving the design components and systems?
Absolutely. There's a whole trend of research going on right now, for instance, about how to use AI as a tool to help find, you know, side channel weaknesses in code and in design. So how do you get rid of these vulnerabilities in the first place? And that's a really great tool to help you do that. It's not necessarily in the hardware when it's done, but it's a very good tool to be used upfront to make your designs secure. So it's on both sides of this word.
Yeah, when it's on both sides, it's really an interesting picture. Thank you. Daniel, what do you think about the past, present, and future of this field?
Yeah, I think the 20, 30 years, for the last 20 years, I think there's been a lot of progress in hardware security catching up with software security, at least from a secure development and architecture mindset. So, you know, for many years, people who are writing code, software primarily, have pretty much understood what the vulnerabilities in software are, you know, from bad coding style, buffer overflow attacks, etc., protecting your interfaces. And most people who write software have known for quite a long time what the pitfalls are and what to do correctly in software. You know, 20, 30 years ago, that in hardware, 20 years ago, nobody knew, right? Nobody knew the problems. And I think there's been a lot of progress in at least in the industry, in secure design reviews. And one big area we had big problems with was where the architects had an idea, the hardware architects knew what the hardware was supposed to do, the security architects knew what the hardware shouldn't do, but the hardware designers had no idea what hardware security was, and always would add various chicken bits, various modes, whether it's for debug or manufacturing, that had enormous security vulnerabilities. And these were largely unknown to the architects, right, who had specified what the product was supposed to be. In the last 10, 20 years, at least at Intel, and I'm certain in most other companies, that those gaps between architecture and design for security have closed on the hardware side, or are closed to the sense where everybody now is reviewing hardware security. And so, at least in the building of the hardware, people have understood what fundamental best good hardware design practices are. On the area where hardware security improvements are slow, I'd say are on things like Helena was saying, on side channel attack mitigations. That's moving fairly slowly. Where I was really spending the majority of my time was actually on fault injection attack mitigations. Those take a very, very long time to come to market. And they're not coming to market very fast. Very, very few people in the industry, or very few companies in the industry, are deploying fault injection detection mitigations across the board, and are primarily deploying those countermeasures in very specific market segments. So an example is we had a blank sheet of paper where we started building a fault injection detection circuit in 2015, and it took till 2021, 2022 to meet the light of day, just because of the nature of hardware, right? In software, you can experiment, you can experiment, you can modify, you can deploy very quickly. With hardware, especially when you're dealing with circuit level design issues, manufacturing, process changes, environmental changes, it just takes a long time to get those circuits to behave like they're supposed to.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. You mentioned earlier that most hardware companies introduced at least a decade ago security reviews for new products and for modifications of existing products. Do you think they helped a lot? Do you think they need to be improved?
I think one of the hard factors of hardware-based security, or any hardware security feature, is, what do you do if there's a problem in the field, right? And that's probably where the biggest improvement needs to be. How to recover from either bugs that are preventing the hardware from being secure, or even worse, the hardware generating false positives and thinking it's under attack when it's not, and shutting down the whole system when it's not supposed to, right? And where that gets really dangerous is any products that have a functional safety requirement, right? Like in automotive or industrial IoT. And so if you have a false positive from a security point of view in an automotive environment where you're doing something like self-driving, and the self-driving shuts down all of a sudden because it's failing safe when it didn't need to fail safe, that's a big problem. And how do you handle that in the field, right? How do you correct for that once it's been deployed? And so that's always a big challenge, because there's a big chicken and the egg with doing field patching of hardware. Like, how, if your root of trust has a bug in it, how does it have the capabilities to patch itself, right? So that's one of the bigger challenges in hardware-based security, fixing bugs once the product's been deployed in the field. You can fix them if you find them before they get deployed from the factory, but how do you fix them in the field? With software, it's much easier, obviously.
Yeah, excellent point. And there are some, remedial answers, but no good answers to this. Patrick, what is your view on the field? You have done a lot of things in hardware security.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Yeah, maybe let me start with picking up on things that Helena and Daniel also mentioned. Hardware security has been around for a long time, and it still, in some aspects, appears to be in the shadows, because people were about passwords and about phishing emails. But in the long term, hardware security will always catch up, either in a bad way or in a good way. And an excellent example of that is all these microarchitecture issues that keep on popping up in terms of side channel leakage and side channel attacks. Side channel analysis has been around for, well, Helena mentioned it, it's almost 30 years. And so it's like this hardware security domain is a training ground, or a field where first the techniques are learned and studied, and then eventually they are clever enough to travel remotely to wherever your computer is running and sort of exploit it. And that's what is happening again and again. And it's to me, it has been quite fascinating to see how hardware security has been able to reach into other fields and impact security issues there. When it comes to one of the top issues, one of the things I want to mention that has not been mentioned so far is the lack of metrics and standards. There are standards, but I think largely hardware security people have a great trouble in explaining how secure their solutions are. And you see that very well I'm an academic, right? So I'm reading papers. Everybody explains their quality of security in a different way. Sometimes it's the number of traces you need. Sometimes it's the time that an attacker has physically on the device in their hands, but there is very few common agreement on actually how to even express it. And with that comes also the lack of good commonly agreed upon data sets, open implementations. It's very telling that, for example, in the field of fault attacks and sidechain attacks, one of the most popular platforms nowadays that has yielded real results is this open source chip whisperer platform, which is something that is, I look upon it as a grassroots development of a designer that put their equipment on the market, and now there's thousands of these kits around there, and you see so many people, researchers, both in industry and in academia, using that because has become their common language of measuring security. And maybe if I may add up one more thing, so besides the lack of metrics and standards, is I want to also stress as a very important issue for hardware security, the role of pre-silicon and testing security before you deploy the hardware. Daniel mentioned that it's hard to fix bugs in the field. And so part of that is that as a designer, as a hardware designer, for us, it's very difficult to measure security when we don't have the chip, when we don't have the hardware. We have simulation techniques, but most of our simulation techniques are focused towards traditional hardware metrics, power, performance, area, that sort of thing, but not against security. And I think that's an important growth field, right? So design automation for hardware security.
That's a very interesting point. So you think there is a connection between all the important points you mentioned, availability of data, the ability to test the designs, the quality of simulations, not always exceptional, and the movement towards the security design automation?
Yes, I think so. And let me give side-channel as an example. Traditionally, we say, well, side-channel leakage is dependency of hardware behavior on secret data. And if you try to quantify that dependency, you'll find it's a can of worms. It starts with timing, then it becomes dynamic power. Then there's issue like coupling. There's issues related to how you distribute power in the hardware. There's issues of optical emissions, electromagnetic emissions, and it sort of keep on coming. And then you wonder, how do I even simulate this, right? Because if we simulate this, we simulate, for example, we can simulate the timing. That's no problem. But then we need to simulate power. Okay, we simulate power, but have you also simulated the EM? Oh, that's yet another simulator. And so you see that all of these different forms of side channel leakage, currently, they have their own way of evaluating it. Yet, in the hardware, we inject only one single secret. It's just that it pops up everywhere in different forms, and all of them are dependency or observable dependencies on that secret. And we have to address all of them.
Excellent example. Certainly a lot of food for thought for all of us. Thank you, Patrick. Rado, you straddle theory and practice, hardware and software. What is your view on the hardware security field?
Oh boy, thanks. First, thanks for having me, and great discussion so far. I'll try to keep things short. I could probably talk for like a couple of days on this. I think the overarching view here is that it's hardware security is a losing battle, and at best a stalemate war, like anything else in security. And let me explain what I want to say there. First of all, security is just a buzzword. It's a meaningless term. And very often it's a buzzword that is misused in dramatically disastrous ways. Without a security policy and a very clear system in place, it's virtually impossible to make statements or prove things or do anything. So there's no generalized tests that we can come up with, unfortunately, to Patrick's point. just because we would have virtually an infinity of security policies that we may want to satisfy depending on where we are. And this is becoming more and more dangerous now because 20, 30 years ago, when you talk about hardware security, you're thinking side channels on a little RFID card. You're thinking maybe HSMs, a couple of the 475A, the original HSME things, and very few other things that were more classified, more in the kind of DoD domain, but not much more than that. And now hardware has come front and center into data centers, clouds, all over the place. As we discussed, these microarchitectural problems occur. They don't really occur. They were always there, but now they start to hit the security policy they're supposed to fit with. And what we realize is, at least in my view, coming from a kind of software, hardware, practical, theoretical background, is that we cannot win this battle when we have resource sharing on a platform, any platform, a CPU or any granularity of a platform. You have resource sharing. And when you have resource sharing, you will have side channels. You will have all kinds of channels, whatever you call them, through that resource you share. And this is what we're seeing here. And this is just a fundamental problem we're not going to be able to solve. And another problem we may not be aware of, just because this appears in software, but I don't think it's been analyzed as much in hardware, is the thing called the bugs per line of code. The bugs per line of code is more of a social phenomenon. And what it says is that in any 100 lines of code, the best programmers in the world, which at some point used to be Google, now I don't know who does that, are having 2 bugs per line of code. It's about 2%. That's the best of the best. And if you can formally verify something, you could get a little bit below that, but you can't formally verify large things. So as a result, just to wrap things up, when you have 2% bugs per line of code and you have a code base, whatever that is now, remember, now we're talking about hardware. So if you talk about the microkernel, we're talking about firmware. But if you talk about microcode, or you talk about Verilog, or you talk about anything else that involves billions of gates, you start getting tens of thousands of bugs that exist there, and there's nothing anybody, not even God, can do anything about. And so now we're faced with this. Is a reality. It's not something we could do anything about. Even if we can't formally verify stuff because we hit a Turing halting. So we can't formally verify things that have billions of gates. We can verify maybe one security property about one security policy that one guy came up with. But there's an infinity of security policies, and now this chip in the field is supposed to hit, is supposed to satisfy. And so basically, there's just no way you can produce secure hardware. What you can do is you could say, well, wait a minute. We have hardware that provides some security properties. It does these security properties well. It fails at others. The equivalent in software would be, we have buffer overflows. Buffer overflows are no problem at all if you deploy that software that has a bug in a proper context, maybe in an isolated context on a single CPU with a single user in a single environment, and so on. So system-wide, you take a thing that you know is flawed, it has some cool things that it gives you, and you put them in the right context. The sacrifice here will be performance and other things, but performance will be one of them. Because now I'm isolating one CPU and I'm saying this core or this CPU is going to do this one thing, and it can't do any other things. And the reason being that I know there will be tens of thousands of bugs in that microkernel that's 10 million lines of code. So my view is not bleak. It's just a cynical, realistic view, and I'm facing this on a daily basis. You can't produce anything secure. You can't write standards. In fact, my view is that standards are horrible. What happens with standards is that you get people to certify things to certain standards that are completely meaningless. And I'm guilty of that. We built secure hardware, built the only server in the world that gives you 140-3 level 4 anti-tamper properties. And we have certification on that, 140-3 level 4 and so on. And if we were to not be honest, we would stop there and say, we have an amazingly secure hardware. And if we are to be honest, we say, holy shit, we found lots and lots of bugs in the firmware, and we keep patching in every single time. But then we lose the certificate when we roll out this firmware. And so certifications and standards are great, but in my view, they actually slow down progress because they give the false illusion. Of course, they're great for marketing. Nobody's going to stop doing certs. I know I'm the edge view on this story here. What we do need to have is better education and better knowledge at where the rubber hits the road. When engineers deploy secure hardware, software people deploy secure hardware, have no clue what security means. The security policy has no relationship with what security meant in the hardware realm. And those two things are now supposed to work together on a, whether it's an Intel chip in a data center or a Google chip that's supposed to do other things. At that interface, we need more knowledge. And I think that's the only advance we could really hope for, is when we have security as a first-class citizen, and also are willing to sacrifice some of these things I mentioned, especially performance. When we need security, you need to be able to be willing to sacrifice performance to get the security you want. For example, for these microarchitectural attacks that are irrelevant. It's irrelevant if I have a microarchitectural attack if I don't share that hardware. I have a CPU. If all the tenants on that CPU are happy to live together, I don't care that I have side channels. I don't care about anything. The security policy will say this whole thing is running on this one CPU. It's dedicated to one task. And so this, but I'm sacrificing sharing, time sharing, resource sharing, whatever type of sharing I'm having on that platform. I told you I'd talk for hours. I'm an academic, so I'll shut up now. I'll let you continue the panel.
Well, it's a plethora of things that are really important. We cannot, lose sight of the dangers of resource sharing. At the same time, we cannot sacrifice the resource sharing. There are always bugs in the software. They cannot be found by the best tests. They can always be exploited. And certifications serve a good purpose, but they are not sufficient for protection. And the sacrifices we need to make for more secure systems are enormous, including performance, which no one wants to give up. How do you think certification could be improved, if it could be improved, to produce a better description of the dangers and challenges, as well as positive features in a certain hardware component or hardware system? Yes.
Should I answer? Okay, good. That's a very good question. I'm going to have a super short answer. Before that, I just want to summarize the story I mentioned before. I think a good summary, I wrote this down, and it's very punchline. I hope your audience would like it. Is that security is like dentistry. Okay, you're always going to have teeth, and there's always going to be teeth problems. You're never going to run out of problems to solve. So if you want to have a nice cushy job, or you want an interesting problem, start working in cybersecurity because you'll have your work set up. Regarding certification, one metric that I find is particularly important is, and it applies to anything. That's the beauty of this metric. It may not be solving everything, but it solves significant amounts of problem, is the complexity of the thing that you deliver. If you can, if when you certify something, can you certify that this is the minimum amount of code that you can put in there? The minimum TCB, the minimum trusted code base. What is the size of your TCB? I'm going to trust your product more if your TCB is 10 times smaller than the other TCB. And the reason I'm saying that is because you see kernels that are in the millions of lines of code, and they get compiled into large binary blobs, and they're completely not needed. We're working on a project for the Navy, and in this project, we go into firmware and remove stuff that's not needed dynamically at runtime. And we can remove like 85%, 90% of a server's firmware while it runs, and that whole blob is not needed. So one certification metric that I believe in is, can we reduce the TCB? Can you show me what the minimum TCB is? Can you deliver this million line of code microkernel in 1,000 lines? If you can give me 1,000 lines, I'm going to trust that software much more. And unfortunately, large corporations cannot do that because of the way supply chains work. We'll get back on this in supply chain conversation if we get there.
Right. 1,000 line code snippet instead of 1,000,000 lines. It certainly is very attractive, probably not very possible, but a very good aspirational goal. And it's a good transition to our next area, supply chains. It's not just the design and potential errors, unknown concerns, the difficulties in mitigation that make hardware security so difficult. It's also the way the supply chain is organized. So, what do you think about this? What are the main issues, including geopolitical, including practically impossible to detect cloning and overproduction, including what Radu mentioned with regard to preserving the code in order to safeguard the supply chain? What do you think is important, and what do you think presents the greatest challenges to the field? Patrick, would you like to start?
Oh, yes, certainly. I was going to, so I thought about this question, and I was thinking supply chain is becoming much, much harder because of the way electronic systems are designed nowadays. So we see this explosion of heterogeneity, and that is actually a fundamental trend. That's just a consequence of the fact that smaller transistors are no longer cheaper to build. Therefore, we cannot just say, let's build a bigger chip next time, and we'll put everything that we have into one chip. Therefore, everything is manufactured together, so it would simplify the supply chain, right? And or the way we assemble components. That's unfortunately no longer true. You may have seen chiplets. You may have heard about how complex systems with GPUs and with heterogeneous processing and so on are now put together. You have definitely multiple sources, and honestly, I don't think that we have truly thought very well in hardware security community on how to address this. I think that there are definitely academic solutions to it, and there are things like puffs and so on. I'm not sure. I'm not in the industry, so I don't know, but I'm not sure how much of that is really deployed. I'm actually interested to hear from other panelists what their thoughts on that. I just want to coin one thought on the supply chain issue, and it's something that I heard a few years ago on certifying airplanes. And there they have a safety aspect, right? But the interesting thing there is if you certify the electronics of an airplane, you do that for the next 20 years, and you're obliged to buy all your components for the next 20 years of airplanes. So your supply chain issue there is addressed by buying one big batch of components and then say, this is the lifetime of this component, we certify it once, and therefore that's how this unreliability or uncertainty in supply chain can be removed. That's what I think about it. So I think it's a big challenge, and it's becoming quickly much harder.
Yeah, absolutely. A big challenge, especially when you think about the lifetime of certain components, as you just mentioned. You are thinking about the supply chain of today with unknown issues that is going to be your product 20 years later, still flying, since you were talking about airplanes. It's probably not a bad problem for artificial intelligence, actually, to anticipate more concerns than we can anticipate with our accumulated knowledge. Excellent point. Thank you. Helena, what do you think?
Let's see. I think I want to throw in a little bit of a positive feeling here. There's something that we can perhaps try to get from the software supply chain issue story, right? So software is like a lot of open source out there, and everybody writes code, everybody takes each other's codes, integrates it everywhere, and in the end you have no idea what's in your code anymore because it's just so much of it. So the hardware security industry has actually come up with an interesting solution or a partial solution for that. This is a technology I came across recently. It's called Sherry, Capability Hardware Enhanced Risk Instructions. And this is a sort of technology made for memory safety, where it says, okay, I'm going to put something in the hardware that allows me not to necessarily secure the software, all of it, and remove bugs and so on, but just make sure that whatever bugs in there is rendered harmless in some sense. So you can run any software you want. It will be not an issue if there's a bug in it. So how do we now come up with something similar or equivalent, one level down at the bottom of the hardware, saying, okay, whatever else is in my hardware, I can kind of render bugs harmless and make them not so bad. So I think that's a direction where we could be thinking a little bit, because in some sense, removing everything, like Radu said, is impossible. There are bugs everywhere. You can't just remove them all. You need 5 or 10 verification engineers for one design engineer. The same way you would need so many more security experts to try to review everything that's been designed by somebody who thinks already that they have done a good job at designing. So is there something that we could imagine would be similar to this kind of technology that makes it such that the bugs we no longer care about? That's an open question, but also there's hope because it exists one layer up for solving the software problem.
Well, yeah, a very good idea. What do you think about software development paradigms that are relatively new that created additional threats to the code base where you cannot use the usual processes for safeguarding security, something like cloud development, even distributed development, even open source, where you can create additional issues by removing a component that everyone is using, for instance. How do you think that could play out for hardware if we use this model?
I think I want to go in the direction of what Radu said again. Keep it small and tiny, as small as you can for the basis. Try to prove, verify, certify everything you can at the smallest inner level possible, and then build from there, because you can't cover it all. So start with something that you're absolutely certain of. Maybe equivalent in software would be 5, 10, 20, 50 instructions. Start from there. Start from the same thing in hardware. I know it's hard to do, but that's the only way you can grow and make something secure in the outer layers.
Thank you. We are developing some agreement on being simpler, being smaller, minimizing performance and security trade-offs. That's very good. Daniel, what do you think from your practitioner's point of view?
Yeah, I mean, so specific to supply chain, I think where I have some interesting experiences in provisioning, and I'd say when you have supply chain issues, one of the larger concerns is how do you provision secrets to your silicon in an untrusted environment, right? Intel, for years was lucky where all of our assembly test silicon fabs were all our own, but then as probably people understand, we moved to TSMC for some products, and so the big challenge we had was, how do you provision these secrets, in a factory that you don't own, right? Which the majority of the world has, right? Those concerns, and so whether you're talking about, I mean, take for example, the necessary evil of global keys, right? Global keys are evil and everybody hates them, but sometimes there's no way around them. And so when you send a netlist to a foundry, now that global key was supposed to be only known to maybe one person in the entire world is now potentially known by the foundry, right? So that really just undermines the whole use of global keys, right? So how do you protect those when you're transferring them to a foundry? How do you provision unique key material to each piece of silicon that a hardware root of trust may make use of for verifying code, as a root of trust for confidentiality, etc., for signing for attestation. So so when you're so that to me, and that's what I think of when I think of supply chain security, because key provisioning was kind of one of the things I worked on a lot. And so you essentially have to build your own secure environment inside an unsecure environment that you don't own, right? And how do you do that? And so most of the foundries and assembly and test sites out there will, give you a caged area where you can bring in HSMs, but it's very costly, right? So I guess my summary would be, you have to think about how to provision secrets securely in an unsecure environment, but it's very costly to do so. And so smaller companies, probably don't have that capability to spend, hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars in building their own mini assembly and test provisioning, right? In some foreign country, right? So there are all sorts of costs to do so, but even on top of that, there are a lot of social engineering issues to be concerned about when handing over provisioning secrets or handing over secrets themselves to your partners, right, that are in your supply chain. So that's my experience with that. That's the pitfalls that I've had to deal with.
And a very important issue, you said it's expensive to replicate elements of security in non-trusted environments. You also said there are threats from social engineering. Isn't it always detrimental to security when there is an additional step introduced in the supply chain or secret deployment? What do you think? Do you think it could be as secure as native or not?
What do you mean by native? I mean, what do you mean by native? Sorry, I wasn't clear.
Well, when the designer manufactured it in their own environment.
Yeah, I mean, there's typically no more steps, right? You're still doing the same thing in an outsourced assembly and test site that's doing key provisioning to your own, right? It's just you're doing it in a foreign environment, right? So the social engineering threats, have gone up tremendously. Assuming you trust your own employees more than you trust, a company's employees. At least your own employees, you typically have control over. You have local laws that you can have influence over because it's your factory. But I don't think there are any more steps doing it in a third party's manufacturing site than doing it in your own. You can, well, at least if you're good, you can keep it the same, right? You don't want to add more steps, as you said, right? You add another step, then you're moving keys from another server to another server that didn't previously exist, and the fewer of those hops you take, the better, of course. But I just think that the social engineering threats were at least very concerning to me, right, when I was involved in designing those provisioning systems.
Yeah, to me also from the reports we are getting, it's emblematic that social engineering has become a definite threat for manufacturing of components. I don't think a lot of attention was paid to something like that 20 or 15 years ago.
One proof that we wrote, or I wrote, that kind of made us feel a little bit more comfortable was that we determined, and what we determined was okay, was that, well, to be compromised, it required 2 social engineering attacks on 2 separate continents, right? That would have to be coordinated. And we figured, and I can't go into all the details, but if these two threats would have to occur, you'd have to have 2 social engineering attacks on 2 separate continents working together, and that to compromise the security of what we were worried about. And so because we were okay with that, right? We felt that was a very low probability of occurring. And that made us sleep at night, right? If it was a single social engineering threat in a single continent, right, that in a single geographical location, that would have made it very hard to sleep at night. So if you have a situation like this where you're giving secrets to a third party, maybe there's another way that you need and that third party has a malicious actor. If they need another malicious actor somewhere, they should try to design your system so you need a second malicious actor stealing something and working with that other malicious actor. So that, anyway, just some food for thought, but that's how we felt slightly more comfortable with this situation.
Thank you. Very good points. Brad, what are your thoughts about the supply chain?
Oh boy.
You said something about it before. Please continue.
Let's keep it. I'll keep it under 2 minutes, I promise. Although I could talk for 2 hours. So first of all, let's just clarify what we're talking about here. So when we talk about supply chain, there's 20 things that we may be talking about. So let's just focus on 2. So one would be this notion of a supply chain and general safety, like aviation and things like this, where you do not, and I repeat, this is important, you do not have actively malicious nation state adversaries or any kind of real adversaries. You have a set of very few parties involved from, that are usually beholden to 2 or 3 major manufacturers, Boeing and Airbus and a couple of others. And wherein the certification really has to do with how bad did we F up here. Let's eliminate the obvious bugs. All these parts are going to have a lot of bugs over the next 20 years. We'll find out the pitot tubes are not going to work properly in the airplanes. This is one of the things that it blows my mind. Or the doors in the Boeings or things like that. But this is a relatively mild. I mean, not really. It's an impactful thing. People will die and so on. But it's a relatively mild type of supply chain issue that I'm not going to focus on because I don't know much about it. And it's not interesting to me in that sense. The interesting part is when you have nation state adversaries that are actively pursuing some agenda to disrupt some security policy wherein some part will participate. And in that case, yeah, I'm sorry to be the guy on the edge, but we have a losing battle here. We cannot win this war. And the problem is this, right? To Daniel's point, a social engineering attack in China is cost less than $4,000 or $5,000. A social engineering attack in Taiwan, one of the engineers working to one of the foundries or the software engineer working some firmware or some microcode, maybe it's going to cost me 20K. I can do that. The fact that Daniel tells me that it requires 2 makes me, I think that's a good thing to have. However, I am a determined adversary and I'm going to pay 40K. I'm going to be fine paying 40K. If that's going to mean that I'm going to disrupt the Google data center in Asheville or, the entire Amazon platform. And so the problem is that there's such an imbalance between the costs and the impact that I fear that we cannot really win this. And the main reason is at the hardware level, maybe we can. So at the hardware level, I don't believe in hardware issues like silicon level supply chain attacks. I don't believe in that. The reason being that it's just so expensive. It's so difficult to maintain. It's so difficult to keep it there in the long term. Wherein firmware and microcode is so much easier to mess with, and it's so much cheaper. It's literally thousands of dollars to mess some microcode up or some firmware up. And that gives me a lot of flexibility. It allows me to update the vulnerability. It allows me to, and the firmware, the supply chains that I'm aware of, which involve usually general purpose processing or even kind of a little bit more customized things, but they involve sometimes upwards of 200, 300 vendors on the back end. Surprisingly, I didn't realize this. So for example, just give you an example, a vanilla motherboard, I shouldn't name the manufacturer, but some vanilla motherboard that most of the US Navy is using is manufactured by, it involves about 700 firmware modules manufactured by about 200 actors, many of which may, based on the code and the disassembly, the way the code really looks, may be based in mainland China. And this firmware is the thing that starts before even Intel boot card gets enabled, before anything on that platform even like starts to be doing anything. This thing has access to even upgrading microcode on the CPU. So if I'm a nation state, and I'll stop, I promise, 30 seconds. If I'm a nation state, I'm not going to attack the silicon. I'm not going to attack the Intel silicon. I'm not going to attack anything. I'm just going to go and pay this gentleman in Wuhan, or in Guangdong, or somewhere in China, $5,000 to insert these 10 lines of code in the firmware he's going to put in there. And I'm going to do that once or twice or 3 times, or how many times Daniel tells me I need to do that, because the security model of that particular component says, oh, we're going to survive 3 attacks. I'm going to pay $15,000. So that's the main problem I see. And we see this actively. And the solution to this, just to converge and shut up in 1 second, is minimize TCB, significantly minimize TCB. We've had this blowout in what a kernel means, what an operating system means. We have thousands. We went from thousands of lines of code. We had Linux. I'm old enough to remember Linux on a floppy drive with the kernel of 16 kilobytes. It was working perfectly fine. You had multi-threading, you had multi-processing, and all that good stuff. 16 kilobytes. And now a vanilla kernel could have, if you compile everything in, it could have 50 million lines of code in it. And the same thing holds for hardware. I'll shut up now. We don't have time. There's much more I want to say here.
Yeah. It's impossible to disagree with it. It would be very attractive to minimize and simplify the features in the components. It's an aspirational goal. It's extremely difficult to implement for the reasons that were mentioned already, but certainly
Claire, to your
very
point,
difficult.
We don't need to minimize the features. This is something that most people don't understand. This blow up happens because of convenience, because the way the supply chain works is you add on module after module after module because nobody thought of minimizing the whole story. And most of these things you don't need. In most OSs, most firmware, even microcode level stuff, most of that stuff you don't need. You could still achieve things in thousands of lines of code. The same features. You'll have the same features, the problem is the time and the thinking about security as a first-class citizen is really the problem here. Supply chains optimize for flow and cash flow specifically.
I didn't phrase it, very clearly, but that's what I mean. There are certainly, elements of code that are not needed. It's very difficult to eliminate them. It's very difficult, impossible at this point, probably to significantly reduce complexity, but it probably would happen at some point through different means, and it certainly is an excellent aspirational goal. We have just enough time for brief conclusions, and let's focus on what are the most promising technology innovations in this field that you think are going to be helpful for the future of hardware security. And Patrick, would you like to start?
Oh, yes, certainly. Yeah, I would like to end on a positive note and mention open source and awareness. And so open source is something that has changed hardware design drastically in the past few years. And so it's not just the IP, but it's also the tools, it's also the technology kits. It is also even at the level of governance. So there's CHIPS Act in the US, there's similar efforts in Europe. So hardware has become much, much more accessible to people. That's one thing. And the other thing is, because it's much more accessible to people, it also means to academia, to students. So I can take this all to my students. And so that's where awareness comes in. It used to be for the longest time that we would teach hardware and hardware security issues by extension through, for example, FPGAs and prototypes, and where essentially your hardware design experience is just a programming experience, right? You don't really see the hardware, you don't really see the chip. And that has all changed because of accessibility. And so that also raises, I can talk to my students to here's a risk processor, here is what it means to collect a power trace. You can simulate it, so it becomes much more tangible. And as a result, I see a greatly increased appreciation for hardware security issues. And I think that's sort of, to me, a very positive starting point. I can now train people and then bring them into the field of hardware security, and they will have from the get-go a much better appreciation of what hardware can actually offer, what are the risks, and what are the defenses that are possible.
Thank you. Open source and awareness and its very strong impact on creating the new generation of hardware security professionals. Well, that's an amazing and positive direction. Thank you, Patrick. Daniel, what do you think?
I think why I'm positive that we're going to see a strong proliferation of hardware security countermeasures in the future is that the researchers are really focusing on it. 20 years ago at Black Hat, you might see one presentation, out of 500 on hardware security. Now you're seeing dozens and dozens on both the attack side and the defense side. So it takes a little bit longer it moves a lot slower than software, but I think because of the researchers that are coming in and demonstrating that it's relatively low cost, right, and relatively very fast to attack hardware, people are starting to open their eyes, and the researchers are embarrassing, hardware companies enough to the point where, and their customers to the point where I think companies are going to have started moving in the direction of adding these countermeasures. They're only doing it because they've been embarrassed by the researchers, but that's a good place to start. So I've been encouraged for the last couple of years that because of these researchers, they seem to be highly motivated.
Thank you. So security research by itself opens up avenues for significant positive impact by making design flaws visible and leading to improvements. Well, definitely, I completely agree. What do you think, Rado, are the most promising trends or trend in hardware security with regard to innovation?
Oh boy. I'm going to be super short because I spoke too much before. So I think actually Daniel just stole my thunder. What I wanted to say exactly that is the researchers and academics embarrassing, I don't want to name names, but large companies that make chips. I think that's the most important advancement we've had, and it's very powerful and it's very useful to have that. This interplay between people breaking things, and this was not happening before. You have a little bit, but the level of attacks and the level of exposure was also different. The reason that is because these chips now have become mainstream, protecting mainstream policies in clouds and data centers, doing things that we didn't have cloud before. This is an important thing. So all this side channel storage, all this SGX stuff, all this stuff has to do with these new models of compute, which came about in the last 15, 20 years. But what I like is to see people keep working on these things and punching. So I think that's the best advance. We can discuss about tools, about AI, about all kind of stuff, but we don't have time. But I think that's the coolest thing. And Daniel, thank you for bringing that up. So I'm just regurgitating that point of yours.
Thank you. More research will lead to significant or at least some improvements. I think we all agree with this. And Helena, you get to make the concluding remarks. What are your thoughts?
Sounds good. Thank you. Well, I think I'd like to go a little bit in the direction of what Patrick said. So to be open source specifically for hardware is like super important. It's all new in the time scales we're talking about for hardware. Something like RISC-V International is just completely amazing, doing an amazing job at open sourcing pretty much everything there is to open source, including looking at security features and things like that. So it's really driving the world in the right direction. I'll throw in, Sherry, I talked about the version for IoT called Chariot, same thing, all open source. You can look at it. You can analyze it, you can agree with it. And finally, we didn't mention it at all, but I can't, talk about hardware security without talking about crypto. So, we've heard about possible future quantum computers attacking all our systems. And I think positively enough here for post-quantum crypto, we kind of got it, right? We're there. We know what to do. We know how to, throw some side channel stuff in there and make it work. We have cool technology like fully homomorphic encryption that's also being out there and being worked on. So a lot of good things happening and a lot of work still to do, but we have made a lot of progress in the end. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It looks like we started on a somewhat pessimistic note. Complexity, redundant code, difficulty in remediation, difficulty in finding issues, and we ended on a positive note with open source creating awareness, increasing the number of real specialists with progress in cryptography, with the agreement, if not concrete steps yet, towards simplification, unnecessary code reduction. I think that was a fascinating discussion. I learned a lot from you. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. I am sure our synchronous and asynchronous listeners will also learn a whole lot from this discussion. I hope there will be an opportunity, because this is such a huge topic, to discuss it in more depth at a later date. I want to thank you, our distinguished panelists. You were amazing, and adjourn this panel, giving the final conclusions to David.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you again to Helena, Daniel, Patrick, and Radu for a fascinating discussion. And I agree, it's good to end on a positive note. It's a very hard subject, and as I think several of you said, we could carry on this discussion, and maybe we should, in a few months' time, come back from a different perspective and revisit the subject. So with many thanks to Claire as our brilliant moderator, this session will be available shortly on YouTube and reported on Substack. And our next webinar will be on post-quantum cryptography in a week's time on Thursday, the 16th of October. And with that, I wish you all a good day, good evening, wherever you are. And thank you for joining this webinar.